Colleville-sur-Mer, American territory in France. We've just seen US President Obama's helicopter land. More than one, in fact, considering the company he's bringing. Obama will welcome French President Francois Hollande in a few moments. Earlier this morning, we went live with you to the French national ceremony at the Caen Memorial, which highlighted the great loss of civilian life 70 years ago today, as Allied forces began their drive to push Hitler's war machine out of occupied France, out of Western Europe. Thousands died among the military forces, American, British, Canadian. There were also Polish. There were also French forces who landed that morning, June the 6th, 1944. But as we heard in the ceremonies earlier this morning, a lot of the groundwork, help in preparing this historic thrust came from the French resistance. Civilians did the right thing whenever possible. As I say, thousands died that day, almost as many civilians as soldiers. Here at the cemetery of Colleville-sur-Mer, there are some, well, more than 9,000 graves.
Ladies and gentlemen, we invite you to take your seats as the binational French-American ceremony for the 70th anniversary of D-Day is about to begin. Please silence your cell phones for the duration of the ceremony.
Mesdames, Messieurs, nous vous demandons de bien vouloir regagner vos places. La cérémonie binationale franco-américaine à l'occasion du 70e anniversaire du jour J va bientôt...
Well, President Obama not getting much time there for a few hellos. After leaving his helicopter, he has to quickly make his way to the site of the ceremony itself, which is about to begin. Now here we're in Colleville-sur-Mer, in Calvados, Normandy. This is American territory on French soil, American cemetery.
It's called the World War II Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial. Part of it is on a cliff overlooking OMAHA Beach and the English Channel in Colleville-sur-Mer, France. We're about 270 kilometers west of Paris.
OMAHA Beach, of course, one of 5, I believe, beaches designated for the landings. By far the bloodiest. The Americans took a fearful beating here from sniper fire and machine gun fire on the cliffs around this beach. It was always likely to be the most difficult beach to take, and so it proved. The Americans lost 2,500 men on Omaha Beach alone.
Notably, they came ashore at Omaha and Utah beaches. The British were at Sword and Gold, the Canadians at Juno Beach. 155,000 men were landed in the space of roughly 24 hours.
And 250,000 in 3 days, I think it was. The others came over after the beachhead had been secured.
The weather wasn't as good as this then. The original D-Day had been planned for the 31st of May. It had to be delayed till the 4th of June. They had to call that off and postpone it because of poor weather. And on the night of the 5th to the 6th, the Supreme Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, said, "Okay, let's go."
And of course, say that to young people today, battles being called off because of bad weather, and they don't understand this age of satellite technology and rain-penetrating radar and high technology. Weather no longer prevents wars from being fought, but only 60 years ago they were a crucial factor.
It's not only the communications, it's waves tossing transport ships.
Sure.
Amphibious landing crafts laden with 7 tanks that if they're let off in water that is unpredictably deep, where you thought it was going to be shallow, you lose the men, you lose the equipment,
and maybe you lose the war.
It was not time to make mistakes. They were only going to have one chance at this, and surprise was a big part of that.
Well, I seem to remember that in '43 they did a practice landing in Dorset, and I think there was a problem with the weather when they tried it, and 900 troops died. They drowned or something in this practice landing. And this was kept quiet.
There was a disastrous practice.
Many years after the war.
A disastrous practice in Dieppe, where most of those who were killed in that run were Canadian troops.
Yes, 42, wasn't it? Dieppe.
And it was in January of 1944 that Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed it's got to happen now, and plans accelerated.
Yeah, because the Russians were just holding up the fort all on their own on the Eastern Front and desperately needed relief.
Saying, when are you, the Western Allies, going to take some of that pressure off? Because it was, of all the many, many millions who died in World War II, more civilians than military forces, Russia and the Soviet Socialist Republics suffered the heaviest losses.
Yes, indeed. Well, the Nazis had a completely different objective when they went east to when they went west. When they went west, they wanted to capture and use the countries they conquered. And when they went east, they just wanted to exterminate and enslave. Very different attitude.
Westwards, it was capture, keep, and cultivate.
Yes.
Eastwards, it was annihilate. When you say younger generations may have more difficulty understanding the complexities involved, for example, in a military offensive and concerning the weather, I'm very happy not to understand it either, as I've never borne arms, I've never seen military service. No one in those days had much of a choice of a certain age.
No, no. No, we're very lucky to live when we do, that's for sure. And I hope everybody watching these ceremonies today will agree with me. That we live the lives we do today, largely in part because of the sacrifices made by this generation here, represented here today.
And many of the people who fought then are still alive and well today. I personally don't know anyone, or don't think I know anyone, who went ashore in Normandy 70 years ago this morning. The bureau chief, the Associated Press bureau chief in Beirut, Webb McKinley, was when my father was posted there. I always heard from my father, I have respect for him. He was a wonderful, peaceful, generous, helpful guy, and he'd gone ashore at Omaha. there are different ways to contribute, of course, and so many of the people involved in that huge Operation Overlord, as the landings were codenamed, weren't necessarily carrying weapons. They were stitching people back together, taking care of the wounded, trying to save the dying. There would be people on the ships. Operation Neptune was the maritime half of that huge thrust. People who remained on the ships, keeping them out there, they were under fire too. I remember a quote from one of the sailors saying, "Yes, I was terrified on D-Day. If I could have hid under the paint, I would have."
Now I'm guessing this is President Hollande arriving from his engagement further up the coast in Caen.
Of course, there's a great deal of anticipation over how President Obama will speak, his handling of this solemn occasion, considering that he is himself also a war president.
Well, when is an American president not a war president in our current epoch, unfortunately? I was going to say it's interesting to perhaps read a subtext into anything Obama says today, bearing in mind the current situation in Europe and Ukraine and American-Russian relationship. There's been a lot of loose talk in the last few weeks about war. Occasions like this remind us of the cost of war and the absolute undesirability of it as a means of resolving problems.
I remember one writer called war, violence, the last resort of the incompetent, and yet when it was a question of driving fascism from occupied countries, there's a great honor in defending, standing up for the right thing. You might call it values which are far more respected today by far more parties, but great efforts, as you say, in referring to Ukraine, great efforts are still needed.
Well, yes, indeed. From the ashes of World War II, we have a lot of the gains to set alongside them. The welfare state is a direct issue of the environment of World War II. The consumer society, the restructuring of the economy towards something that offered a little more to more people. These are all gains that you can argue were won by the sacrifices made by ordinary people in the Second World War. And yet they are gains that some nations in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, have yet to taste fully.
Let's remember that after World War II, it was immediately followed by the Cold War, right up until, let's say, 1990. If you've been following the news this morning, you may have seen our coverage showing separate dinners in Paris, where President Hollande hosted Putin at the Élysée Palace and dined separately with Obama and his entourage in a fine restaurant, keeping those leaders apart, working diplomatically, trying to open doors, open spaces for better
Yes.
developments.
Yeah, indeed, I suppose these commemorations come at a very good time. It's a good neutral opportunity for these leaders to get together and perhaps have a few quiet words face to face. And the symbolism of the event won't be lost on them. They will perhaps be more attuned to dialogue and compromise here in Normandy than they might be on the phone between Washington and Moscow.
I might be slightly paraphrasing, but a great quote from Winston Churchill about talking rather than making war.
Yeah.
Remember,
Yes,
jaw is better than war. Let's see, I've got something here. Winston Churchill addressing the House of Commons at around noon on the 6th of June 1944. And just one excerpt here. Reports are coming in rapid succession. So far the commanders who are engaged report that everything is proceeding according to plan, and what a plan. This vast operation, said Winston Churchill 70 years ago this morning, this vast operation is undoubtedly the most complicated and difficult that has ever taken place, involving tides, wind, waves, visibility from the air and the sea, and the combined employment of land, air and sea forces in the highest degree of intimacy.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the entrance of the President of the French Republic, Francois Hollande, and the President of the United States of America, Barack Obama.
Mesdames, Messieurs, veuillez s'il vous plaît vous lever pour l'arrivée de la délégation présidentielle. Le président de la République française, François Hollande, et le président des États-Unis d'Amérique, Barack Obama.
Please remain standing for the posting of the colors and the playing of the national anthems of the French Republic and the United States of America.
Nous vous demandons de rester debout pendant les honneurs au drapeau et les hymnes nationaux de la France et des États-Unis.
A lot of protocol in play today, here, now. I find it curious to hear the announcement of the French Republic and then United States of America rather than the United States of America, the American Republic. There are many crowned heads of Europe taking part in the ceremonies today.
Yes, and they're all equals, faced with the magnitude of the occasion they are commemorating.
Good point. There is even the president of the Republic of Slovakia, which did not exist 70 years ago, as there was Czechoslovakia. fair to say we're on territory that could be called home of the brave here.
Yes, I thought the band was quite jaunty there for both versions.
Well, given the gravity of the occasion, it could use all the spirit lifting we can get.
Yeah, sure. But it's a sunny day, and these are good memories as well as bad that we're celebrating here, we're remembering here today.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, please be seated.
It's a moment for honoring.
Monsieur le Président Hollande, Monsieur le Président Obama, Mesdames et Messieurs les représentants des autorités, Mesdames et Messieurs, vous êtes invités à vous asseoir.
It is our privilege to welcome all the distinguished visitors joining us today. We extend a special welcome to the D-Day and World War II veterans and their family members in attendance who honor us all with their presence. Today, we commemorate the 70th anniversary of the D-Day landings, which began on the morning of June 6, 1944. Today's ceremony will honor our military men and women who made the ultimate sacrifice for the liberation of Europe. Including among those we honor are the 9,387 of our fallen veterans interned at this sacred ground and the 1,557 missing in action inscribed on the wall of the missing.
C'est un honneur pour nous d'accueillir tous les invités qui nous ont rejoints en ce jour mémorable. Nous souhaitons la bienvenue aux vétérans du débarquement.
And the French version of that same introductory address.
De leurs familles qui nous honorent de leur présence.
These ceremonies are an opportunity to pay a special tribute to the veterans. Let's also underscore that around French veterans, as well as 800 foreign veterans, will be present at this commemoration.
Parmi ceux à qui nous rendrons hommage figurent les 9387 Américains qui sont enterrés dans cette terre sacrée et les 1557 disparus au combat inscrits sur le mur des disparus.
Half of the foreign veterans have come from Britain, 1/4 from the United States.
Please bow your heads for the invocation delivered by the Most Reverend F. Richard Spencer.
Mesdames et messieurs, veuillez s'il vous plaît observer un moment de recueillement pendant la prière de l'aumônier militaire, le révérend F. Richard Spencer.
And now a prayer and a moment silence for the fallen.
Together in prayer. Almighty and eternal God, as we gather here on holy ground to remember the fallen heroes of yesterday, everything we see, everything that we cannot see, exists because of you alone. Peace comes from you. It all belongs to you. Peace exists for your glory. History is our story. Our task here today is to not fix the blame for the past, but to fix the course for the future. Give to our government and military leaders the wisdom to lead us with humility, the courage to lead us with integrity, the compassion to lead us with generosity. Help us, O God, to remember that we are human beings, united not by race or religion or blood, but to our common commitment to freedom and justice for all. Help us to share, to serve, and to seek the common good for everyone. And whenever we face difficult days ahead, may we have a new birth of clarity in our aims, responsibility in our actions, humility in our approaches, and civility in our attitudes, even when we differ from one another. May all people of goodwill today join together to work for a more just, a more healthy, and a more prosperous world, and a peaceful planet. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the French Republic, Francois Hollande.
Mesdames, Messieurs, le Président de la République française, François Hollande.
Monsieur le Président des États-Unis d'Amérique, cher Barack,
President of the United States of America, dear Barack Obama,
Messieurs les combattants du débarquement,
gentlemen,
vétérans,
the soldiers
Mesdames, Messieurs,
from the D-Day landings, the veterans, ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to celebrate on the 6th of June
une date mémorable
a
de
date,
notre histoire.
a memorable date for our history, a date on which
Dans le même
our two
combat,
peoples came together, our two nations came together in the same fight, the fight for liberty.
réunis à côté d'une plage,
We come together today
celle que nous voyons du cimetière de Colleville,
next to a beach.
une belle plage.
The beach we see from the Colleville cemetery, a beautiful beach, one that's calm, one that's peaceful.
1944,
On the 6th of June,
c'était un
1944,
champ de bataille. Et c'est ce que nous avons voulu
that beach was a dreadful battlefield.
70 ans après.
That's what we're here to remember today, 70 years
Dans
later.
l'histoire, il y a toujours des épreuves.
As in history, there are always tests, trials, and tribulations. Nothing ever happens as
Tout
expected.
avait mal
And in the early hours of this morning,
sur OMAHA Beach,
that morning, everything seemed to go wrong on Omaha Beach.
malencontreusement en arrière des défenses allemandes.
The bombs landed, unfortunately, behind the German defense systems.
Les chars
The artillery
les
missed its target. The tanks that were supposed to support the foot soldiers had
des
sunk.
premières vagues d'assaut,
Also, the men from the first assault waves found themselves alone, completely alone, with
face aux,
light arms facing the
face aux mitrailleuses.
formidable guns of defense, the German machine guns.
Massacrés,
Many were
et les
massacred,
survivants cloués
mutilated,
sur le sable.
filled with holes. The soldiers had no choice but to lie on the sand in the midst of dead bodies and the injured, unable to move
Vers eux,
under the withering fire which continued as the sea
les nazis
rushed
étaient
forward,
sûrs d'eux. Ils
the
avaient
tide of
construit
blood.
un mur.
The Nazis were sure of themselves. They'd built a wall,
Rien ne pouvait les
the Atlantic Wall. Nothing
Ils n'avaient pas
could reach
Dans
them,
les démocraties, un grand
they felt, but they had not
bravoure.
planned for the great ideal of democracy that would render people so brave, so that people from all around the world,
Sur un
out
continent.
of the shadows, would come to risk their lives and give their lives
Comme l'a
for
dit
those
Omar Bradley,
on another continent, the continent of freedom. General Omar Bradley said, I quote, "Each man who set foot on Omaha Beach on the 6th of June 1944 was a hero."
ces
End of quote.
soldats qui
So these young soldiers
se regroupèrent
who were on this beach,
sans ordre, sans plan,
grouped together with a few officers, with no plan, with no orders,
courage, vers les lignes
and ran with
inattendus, impétueux,
their
irrésistibles.
courage, almost their only weapon, towards the enemy lines. They resisted the temptation to flee. They stayed, and by the beginning of the afternoon,
Et le débarquement.
Omaha Beach was won,
Omaha, Utah,
and the landing was seen to have been a success.
que l'on prononce
Omaha, Utah,
en anglais, tous ces noms
the
évoquent la souffrance et la gloire.
all the
La
places
désolation, la
we
cruauté.
pronounce memories of suffering and glory, but suffering, cruelty, freedom, the light at the end of the tunnel. More than 20,000 Americans left their lives here in Normandy, 20,838. I don't want to leave out a single one of them. They were your parents, your brothers, your friends.
Ils furent nos libérateurs.
They were our liberators.
Jamais ce qu'elle doit
France will never forget what it owes as a country to these soldiers.
Unis.
France will never forget what it owes to the United States.
La solidarité entre nos deux.
France will never forget
La solidarité qui
the solidarity that exists between our two nations. It's this solidarity that during the course of the two major tragedies of the last century, the world wars. It's based on a common ideal, the dream, the passionate adoration of freedom.
Toujours souvenu de la contribution de la France.
The United States has always remembered France's contribution to its great revolution. So in 1917, when the independence of France was under threat, the US was at our side to help protect our freedom. In 1944, when France was occupied by the enemy forces, once again, America stood by us, came to free us. I know how much it cost the American people, this great friendly nation. I know what sacrifices you made. I'm aware of your losses and all of your misfortune. 11,000 American soldiers are honored here at Colleville-sur-Mer in this small village in Normandy, which in June 1944 was the site of some of the most important moments in history, the history of the Second World War. Today, this site is a memorial bringing together our two countries. The martyrs of OMAHA, the Pointe du Hoc martyrs, the Sainte-Mère d'Église paratroopers, the soldiers from the Battle of the Hedges, all of these people died in order to free Europe. I'd like to quote a few names, cite a few names of heroes. L'Hérite, the son and the father, are here. They were killed in July 1944, one in Italy, one in Normandy. Both died in order to save Europe. I could also refer to all these brothers who were taken away by the war. There are 66 buried here in pairs, side by side. Among all these white crosses that we can see, there are 3 that bear the Gold Star, the highest military distinction in the United States. Lieutenant Jimmy Monty, who was one of the first soldiers to land on Omaha Beach, he fought all day, unprotected on the beach, until he was struck by an enemy bullet. He didn't live to see victory. Sergeant Perigry, who on the 8th of June alone captured a defense post, 43 Germans were defending it. He died 4 years later of his wounds.
C'est le général Theodore Roosevelt Jr., le vainqueur d'Utah Beach, fils du
General Theodore Roosevelt Jr.,
mort à 56 ans,
the son of the president who died at the age of 46 at Sainte-Mère l'Église on the 12th of July 1944. He's buried alongside his brother Quentin, who was shot down, who was shot out of the sky above Champagne on the 14th of July 1918 in the First World War. These crosses stand alongside one another. They bear witness to the thread, the indelible link that brings our nations together from one generation to the next. So, Mr. President, I'd like to renew the sermon all my predecessors have made. I would stress, we will never forget the sacrifice made by American soldiers. Mr. President, we're the children and the grandchildren of those generations. We've inherited their pasts. I was born here in Normandy. I was born in Rouen, in a mostly destroyed, a city that was mostly destroyed in that battle. You were born in Hawaii, in that state of your country that was the most harshly struck in that war. Our parents and grandparents have told us stories of those very difficult times, the pain and the suffering. Our parents and our grandparents raised us with the idea that in order to bring about change, nothing must be forgotten. I refer to this joint memory that we share. It's what has enabled our two nations to create hope, hope that's also a duty to fight for peace. This is
Normandie qui rassemble
the image Normandy's putting forward today.
la Normandie où
Normandy today has the world at its feet.
qui aujourd'hui sont réunis.
Here, where different nations fought one another, these nations have come together here to celebrate. I stress the word celebrate, to celebrate this important day.
Malgré
Mr. President, for the last 70 years, the United States, in spite of adversity and crises, the United States
la France.
has always
Cette amitié,
remained at France's side.
deux pays qui depuis
It's been a lasting friendship.
ont cheminé ensemble sur la
And
voie du progrès.
this friendship, over 2 centuries,
De deux pays
has helped us to move forward together, making progress in our societies, a form of friendship that
et à la
makes it possible for us to
qui luttent
to
contre
put
l'oppression
humanity before hatred,
et qui
to
ont
fight oppression,
cette ambition
to drive back the dark shadows that attempt to overtake countries. And we share the goal of trying to make the world a more democratic place where peace is omnipresent.
infatigable.
The French people see peace in the United States as a tireless form of energy
Le rêve de la réussite.
to create
Que les Français
a capacity that enables people to achieve their dreams. What the French admire most of all in the American people, because they themselves
c'est la
are the most ardent defenders of this, is the love that you have for freedom.
que l'essentiel est en jeu.
And my compatriots know
Lorsque les principes sont en cause,
that when everything that's most dear to us is in danger, when our principles are being threatened,
dans ce terrible état,
France and the United States will always be on the same side as they were in that terrible summer, June 1944, on the beaches of Normandy and the beaches of Provence.
aujourd'hui,
At the time, it was a question of fighting against Nazi barbarity. Still today, our countries stand together
réchauffement climatique,
to rise to other challenges and threats. Climate change,
développement,
the inequalities that exist in our world, poverty, hunger.
encore aujourd'hui, nous sommes unis.
Yes, even today, still today, we're united in the face of other dangers.
Le fondamentalisme,
We believed that some dangers had disappeared forever: racism, extremism, fundamentalism, terrorism.
cette cérémonie de
And this is why
une dimension.
I believe that this ceremony today
Le silence de
takes on a particularly important dimension. The silence that reigns in this place expresses so much better than any speech will do the message carried by the soldiers who lie here. These soldiers died so that we would be free.
de l'histoire
Let us
qui nous rassemble
deserve,
pour continuer
let's be deserving of this history that brings us together in order to continue our approach. Long live America, long live France,
de ceux qui sont tombés.
and long live the memory of those people who fell here for our freedom.
Our French host Francois Hollande there,
The President of
giving
the
a presidential speech
Barack
and
Obama.
setting the scene for his guest,
Messieurs,
President Barack Obama.
des États-Unis d'Amérique, Barack Obama.
President Hollande, the people of France, friends, family, our veterans. If prayer were made of sound, the skies over England that night would have deafened the world. Captains paced their decks, pilots tapped their gauges, commanders pored over maps, fully aware that for all the months of meticulous planning, everything could go wrong. The winds, the tides, the element of surprise, and above all, the audacious bet that what waited on the other side of the channel would compel men not to shrink away, but to charge ahead. Fresh-faced GIs rubbed trinkets, kissed pictures of sweethearts, checked and rechecked their equipment. God, asked one, give me guts. And in the pre-dawn hours, planes rumbled down runways, gliders and paratroopers slipped through the sky. Giant screws began to turn on an armada that looked more like ships than sea. And more than 150,000 souls set off toward this tiny sliver of sand upon which hung more than the fate of a war, but rather the course of human history. President Hollande, distinguished guests, I am honored to return here today to pay tribute to the men and women of a generation who defied every danger. Among them are veterans of D-Day. And gentlemen, we are truly humbled by your presence here today. Just last week, I received a letter from a French citizen. Dear Mr. President and the American people, he wrote, we are honored to welcome you, to thank you again for all the pain and efforts of the American people and others in our common struggle for freedom. Today, we say the same to the people of France. Thank you, especially for the generosity that you've shown the Americans who've come here over the generations, to these beaches and to this sacred place of rest for 9,387 Americans. At the end of the war, when our ships set off for America filled with our fallen, tens of thousands of liberated Europeans turned out to say farewell. And they pledged to take care of the more than 60,000 Americans who would remain in cemeteries on this continent. In the words of one man, we will take care of the fallen as if their tombs were our children's. And the people of France, you have kept your word, like the true friends you are. We are forever grateful. Here, we don't just commemorate victory, as proud of that victory as we are. We don't just honor sacrifice, as grateful as the world is. We come to remember why America and our allies gave so much for the survival of liberty at this moment of maximum peril. We come to tell the story of the men and women who did it, so that it remains seared into the memory of a future world. We tell this story for the old soldiers who pulled themselves a little straighter today to salute brothers who never made it home. We tell the story for the daughter who clutches a faded photo of her father, forever young. For the child who runs his fingers over colorful ribbons he knows signifies something of great consequence, even if he doesn't yet fully understand why. We tell this story to bear what witness we can to what happened when the boys from America reached Omaha Beach. By daybreak, blood soaked the water. Bombs broke the sky. Thousands of paratroopers had dropped into the wrong landing sites. Thousands of rounds bit into flesh and sand. Entire companies worth of men fell in minutes. Hell's Beach had earned its name. By 8:30 a.m., General Omar Bradley expected our troops to be a mile inland. 6 hours after the landings, he wrote, we held only 10 yards of beach. In this age of instant commentary, the invasion would have swiftly and roundly been declared, as it was by one officer, a debacle. But such a race to judgment would not have taken into account the courage of free men. Success may not come with rushing speed, President Roosevelt would say that night, but we shall return again and again. And paratroopers fought through the countryside to find one another. Rangers pulled themselves over those cliffs to silence Nazi guns. To the west, Americans took Utah Beach with relative ease. To the east, the British tore through the coast, fueled by the fury of 5 years of bombs over London and a solemn vow to fight them on the beaches. The Canadians, whose shores had not been touched by war, drove far into France. And here, at Omaha, troops who finally made it to the seawall used it as shelter, where a general barked, "If you're Rangers, lead the way." By the end of that longest day, this beach had been fought, lost, refought, and won. A piece of Europe once again liberated and free. Hitler's wall was breached, letting loose Patton's army to pour into France. Within a week, the world's bloodiest beach had become the world's busiest port. Within a month, 1 million Allied troops thundered through Normandy into Europe. And as our armies marched across the continent, one pilot said it looked as if the very crust of the earth had shaken loose. The Arc de Triomphe lit up for the first time in years. And Paris was punctuated by shouts of "Vive la France! Vive les États-Unis!" Of course, even as we gather here at Normandy, we remember that freedom's victory was also made possible by so many others who wore America's uniform. 2 years before he commanded armies, Eisenhower's troops sliced through North Africa. 3 times before D-Day, our GIs stormed the beaches at Sicily, Salerno, Anzio. Divisions like the Fighting 36th brawled their way through Italy, fighting through the mud for months, marching through towns past waving children before opening the gates to Rome. As the dog faces marched to victory in Europe, the devil dogs, the Marines, clawed their way from island to island in the Pacific in some of the war's fiercest fighting. And back home, an army of women, including my grandmother, rolled up their sleeves to help build a mighty arsenal of democracy. But it was here, on these shores, that the tide was turned in that common struggle for freedom. What more powerful manifestation of America's commitment to human freedom than the sight of wave after wave after wave of young men boarding those boats to liberate people they had never met? We say it now as if it couldn't be any other way. But in the annals of history, the world had never seen anything like it. And when the war was won, we claimed no spoils of victory. We helped Europe rebuild. We claimed no land other than the earth where we buried those who gave their lives under our flag and where we stationed those who still serve under it. But America's claim, our commitment to liberty, our claim to equality, our claim to freedom and to the inherent dignity of every human being, that claim is written in the blood on these beaches, and it will endure for eternity. Normandy, this was democracy's beachhead. And our victory in that war decided not just a century, but shaped the security and well-being of all posterity. We worked to turn old adversaries into new allies. We built new prosperity. We stood once more with the people of this continent through a long twilight struggle until finally a wall tumbled down and an iron curtain too. And from Western Europe to East, from South America to Southeast Asia, 70 years of democratic movements spread. And nations that once knew only the blinders of fear began to taste the blessings of freedom. None of that would have happened without the men who were willing to lay down their lives for people they'd never met and ideals they couldn't live without. None of it would have happened without the troops President Roosevelt called the lifeblood of America, the hope of the world. Home barely more than boys, returned home heroes. But to their great credit, that is not how this generation. After the war, some put away their medals, were quiet about their service, moved on. Some, carrying shrapnel and scars, found it was much harder. Many, like my grandfather, who served in Patton's army, lived a quiet life, trading one uniform and set of responsibilities for another, as a teacher or a salesman or a doctor or an engineer, a dad, a grandpa. Our country made sure millions of them earned a college education, opening up opportunity on an unprecedented scale. And they married those sweethearts and bought new homes and raised families and built businesses, lifting up the greatest middle class the world has ever known. And through it all, they were inspired, I suspect, by memories of fallen brothers. Memories that drove them to live their lives each day as best they possibly could. Whenever the world makes you cynical, stop and think of these men. Whenever you lose hope, stop and think of these men. Think of Wilson Caldwell, who was told he couldn't pilot a plane without a high school degree, so he decided to jump out of a plane instead. And he did here on D-Day with the 101st Airborne when he was just 16 years old. Think of Harry Kolkowitz, the Jewish son of Russian immigrants, who fudged his age at enlistment so he could join his friends in the fight. And don't worry, Harry, the statute of limitations has expired. Harry came ashore at Utah Beach on D-Day. And now that he's come back, We said he could have anything he wants for lunch today. He helped liberate this coast after all, but he said a hamburger would do fine. What's more American than that? Think of Rock Merritt, who saw a recruitment poster asking him if he was a man enough to be a paratrooper, so he signed up on the spot. And that decision landed him here on D-Day with the 508th Regiment, a unit that would suffer heavy casualties. And 70 years later, it's said that all across Fort Bragg, they know Rock. Not just for his exploits on D-Day or his 35 years in the Army, but because 91-year-old Rock Merritt still spends his time speaking to the young men and women of today's Army and still bleeds OD green for his 82nd Airborne. Whenever the world makes you cynical, whenever you doubt that courage and goodness is possible, stop and think of these men. Wilson and Harry and Rock, they are here today. And although I know we already gave them a rousing round of applause, along with all our veterans of D-Day, if you can stand, please stand. If not, please raise your hand. Let us recognize your service once more. These men waged war so that we might know peace. They sacrificed so that we might be free. They fought in hopes of a day when we no longer need to fight. We are grateful to them. Gentlemen, I want each of you to know that your legacy is in good hands. For in a time when it has never been more tempting to pursue narrow self-interest, to slough off common endeavor, this generation of Americans, a new generation, our men and women of war, have chosen to do their part as well. Rock, I want you to know that Staff Sergeant Melvin Cedillo Martin, who's here today, is following in your footsteps. He just had to become an American first, because Melvin was born in Honduras, moved to the United States, joined the Army. After tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, he was reassigned to the 82nd Airborne, and Sunday he'll parachute into Normandy. I became part of a family of real American heroes, he said, the paratroopers of the 82nd. Wilson, you should know that Specialist Janice Rodriguez joined the Army not even 2 years ago, was assigned to the 101st Airborne, and just last month earned the title of the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault Soldier of the Year. And that's inspiring but not surprising when the women of today's military have taken on responsibilities including combat like never before. I want each of you to know that their commitment to their fellow service members and veterans endures. Sergeant First Class Brian Hawthorne's grandfather served under General Patton and General MacArthur. Brian himself served 2 tours in Iraq, earned the Bronze Star in Baghdad for saving the life of his best friend, and today he and his wife use their experience to help other veterans and military families navigate theirs. And Brian's here in Normandy to participate in Sunday's jump. And here, just yesterday, he re-enlisted in the Army Reserve. And this generation, this 9/11 generation of service members, they too felt something. They answered some call. They said, I will go. They too chose to serve a cause that's greater than self. Many even after they knew they'd be sent into harm's way. And for more than a decade, they have endured tour after tour. Sergeant First Class Corey Remsburg has served 10. And I've told Corey's incredible story before, most recently when he sat with my wife Michelle at the State of the Union address. It was here at Omaha Beach on the 65th anniversary of D-Day, where I first met Corey and his fellow Army Rangers, right after they made their own jump into Normandy. The next time I saw him, he was in the hospital, unable to speak or walk after an IED nearly killed him in Afghanistan. But over the past 5 years, Corey has grown stronger, learning to speak again and stand again and walk again. And earlier this year, he jumped out of a plane again. And the first words Corey said to me after his accident echoed those words first shouted all those years ago on this beach: "Rangers, lead the way." So Corey has come back today along with Melvin and Janice and Brian and many of their fellow active duty service members. We thank them for their service. They are a reminder that the tradition represented by these gentlemen continues. We are on this earth for only a moment in time. And fewer of us have parents and grandparents to tell us about what the veterans of D-Day did here 70 years ago. As I was landing on Marine One, I told my staff, I don't think there's a time where I miss my grandfather more, where I'd be more happy to have him here than this day. So we have to tell their stories for them. We have to do our best to uphold in our own lives the values that they were prepared to die for. We have to honor those who carry forward that legacy, recognizing that people cannot live in freedom unless free people are prepared to die for it. And as today's wars come to an end, this generation of servicemen and women will step out of uniform, and they too will build families and lives of their own. They too will become leaders in their communities, in commerce and industry and perhaps politics, the leaders we need for the beachheads of our time. And God willing, they too will grow old in the land they helped to keep free. And someday, future generations, whether 70 or 700 years hence, will gather at places like this to honor them and to say that these were generations of men and women who proved once again that the United States of America is and will remain the greatest force for freedom the world has ever known. May God bless our veterans and all who serve with them, including those who rest here in eternal peace, and may God bless all who serve today for the peace and security of the world. May God bless the people of France, and may God bless our United States of America.
Well, so much for the speeches. There will now be joint wreath-laying here at the Colleville-sur-Mer American Cemetery. President Obama, President Hollande will be laying flowers in honor of the dead.
Hollande and President Obama will now lay a wreath in honor of those who served and those who made the ultimate sacrifice to liberate Europe. Please now observe a moment of silence.
Mesdames et messieurs,
The moment of silence will be followed by the wreath-laying and a full 21-gun salute.
en l'honneur de ceux qui servirent leur pays et qui firent le sacrifice suprême pour la libération de l'Europe, suivi d'une minute de silence.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for a 21-gun salute, the playing of taps, and a flyover by the United States Air Force F-15s flying in a missing man formation.
Mesdames et messieurs, merci de vous lever pour une salve de 21 coups de canon, la sonnerie aux morts et le survol des F-15 de l'armée de l'air américaine en formation en hommage aux disparus.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain at your seats while President Hollande and President Obama thank veterans, then move to the observation point of Omaha Beach. An announcement will be made when the ceremony has ended.
Mesdames et messieurs, nous vous demandons de rester assis pendant que le président Hollande et le président Obama se dirigent vers la table d'orientation surplombant Omaha Beach. Une annonce sera faite pour vous signaler la fin de la cérémonie.
Well, you know it's all over when you hear this tune, don't you? That was the celebration of the fallen for the 70th anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy. Presidents Francois Hollande and Barack Obama now shaking the hands of World War II veterans who've come here to Colleville-sur-Mer for this ceremony. Speeches by the French and American presidents. It's not the last of the events today. We move on from here to the British war ceremony, and Euronews will also be covering the events there and the events throughout the day. But for the moment, we're returning to our regular news broadcasts. Back in Normandy later.
He was a key player in France's World Cup triumph in 1998.